When I was a boy, there were people who became, for want of a better word, heroes. Those whose life stories fired my imagination. I read about some in the Ladybird books or other history books, a couple of which I still have. And there were people who we were told about in school, or I learned about in the cinema, and later through television. October celebrates a man who fascinated me from about the age of 7 or 8. I first came across him in one of the Wide Range readers. This man fascinated me so much because of his love for nature and of all creatures, great and small. The story that first brought him to me was of his encounter with a wolf that was causing problems in Gubbio, a town in Italy's Umbrian hills, and a story which may not be entirely true, but must have some basis of truth in it somewhere. However, what is certain is that this was a man who had a real affinity with animals. This man was, of course, St. Francis, who towards the end of his life wrote these words: "Blessed are they who uphold peace. By you, Most High, they will be crowned." Francis was born in 1181 in the ancient walled town of Assisi, the son of a wealthy cloth merchant who traded in France and had married a French wife. It was assumed that Francis would eventually take over his father's business, but Francis had a rebellious youth and a difficult relationship with his father. In a war between Assisi and neighbouring Perugia, Francis was taken prisoner, and whilst in prison he became seriously ill, and he returned home a changed person. Whilst out walking, he came upon the small ruined church of San Damiano, and as he stood within its crumbling walls, he heard a voice saying, "Go and repair my house." Taking this literally, Francis sold some of his father's cloth and offered the money to the priest to rebuild the church. Unsurprisingly, this caused some conflict with his family, which came to a head when Francis stripped himself naked in the marketplace and returned his clothes to his father. Wearing a simple cloak given him by the bishop and money he had begged, Francis set out into the countryside to rebuild the church of San Damiano. He was soon joined by 7 friends. Francis and his followers lived in extreme poverty, preaching, labouring, and serving the needy. In time, they would become the order of Franciscan friars. Many stories, true and legendary, have grown up surrounding Francis. Among them his preaching to the birds, his taming of the wolf, and his receiving of the stigmata, the wounds of Jesus Christ. Francis died at sunset, lying on the bare earth as he had requested, on Saturday the 3rd of October 1226. He was only 45 years old, but his order had already begun to spread across Western Christendom. 14 years ago, I got the opportunity to walk in the footsteps of St. Francis, when Roberta and I spent 5 days in Assisi. Assisi is a small hillside town, and you get the impression that it has not changed that much over the centuries. New to Francis would of course be the great 2-level basilica built shortly after his death, which bears his name, and in whose crypt lies his tomb, together with those of his most trusted friends. Ironically, a church that dominates the skyline, and in its magnificence is everything which Francis never stood for, and yet in many ways is a fitting memorial and reminder of this most humble of men. There are in Assisi the inevitable tourist shops selling all manner of things, but despite this, Assisi has a peace and serenity built into it. In the evenings you feel quite safe within its narrow streets, After all, the rowdiest thing you're likely to come across is a group of giggling nuns. People are drawn to this hillside town by one thing only: St. Francis. To go to early morning prayers at 6:30, followed by Mass in the lower basilica, is very moving, as you sit in the dimly lit seats surrounded by frescoes, one of which, by the Renaissance painter Ciambui, depicts what scholars think is a real likeness of the saint. In other churches in Assisi, you can find the patched, worn garment, the only thing that Francis possessed when he died, and would have given away had anybody asked him for it, and the ancient font in which Francis was baptized, and which is still used today, and the cross in Francis's day hung in San Damiano, and then there is San Damiano itself. To reach the church, you have to walk down a very steep hill. We walked down that hill on a sunny afternoon, and I remember that there were poppies in the surrounding fields, and that the skies were a clear blue. San Damiano became a convent that housed Clare, a friend of Francis, who with her followers founded the order of nuns that became known as the Little Clares. The convent remains almost frozen in time, and in the peacefulness of a late summer afternoon, you can actually reach back 800 years, especially when you look onto the refectory table and benches on which Francis, Clare, and their friends once sat and ate and talked and laughed. And as you stand and look and think, you step into the past, as you enter into the lives of Francis and his companions. Assisi is one of those places in our world where it is not difficult to find God. So what is it that makes Francis so special? Well, he gave us the Nativity play. He wrote, just before he died, the beautiful poem, The Canticle of the Sun, in which he refers to brother sun and sister moon, brother wind and sister water, brother fire and mother earth, a poem that ecologists use and refer to, often forgetting that it is, above all things, a celebration not of creation, but of the Creator. Francis, above all things, was a man in tune with creation, a humble, spiritual man who embodied all that was honest and true in the way he lived and in the way he treated people, and valued and appreciated all creation. The Francis who is remembered and loved today is not really the Francis who walked the Umbrian hills so long ago. That Francis is one who should make our age, and does, I suppose, if you look at him carefully, a little uncomfortable, as he did his own age. Francis is a man who calls for peace, a man who challenges our secular age when talk of God is awkward, when his love of God drove everything that he did. Francis calls us, in our world, to simplicity, in our world, our materialistic world, in which the meaning and measure of life is so often counted by the things we have and own. In cultures drowning in rampant individualism, where self is so important, this barefoot, raggledy-robed man calls us to something bigger than ourselves. He tried to instill in his contemporaries a profound gratitude towards God and the world that nurtured them, and he calls us today to do exactly the same. Why do I love Francis so much? One thing is his love of animals, but more important, simply because the medieval Francis, who lived 800 years ago, still shows the world that there is a better way. He was an optimist who saw beauty, goodness, and the love of God everywhere. That is why, 8 centuries after his death, millions are still drawn each year to visit his tomb. Blessed are they who uphold peace. By you, our God, they will be crowned.